The basement apartment smelled like old wood and coffee that had been sitting too long in the pot. It was nearly midnight, and most college students were either cramming for exams or out enjoying their Friday night. But there she was, sitting at a piano that had seen better days, its ivory keys yellowed with age and its surface covered in water ring stains from countless forgotten mugs. She ran her fingers across the keys for what felt like the 100th time that week. 4 chords. That's all it was. 4 simple chords that kept playing in her head like a song stuck on repeat. She'd tried to shake it off, tried to work on something more complex, something that might impress her music theory professor. But every time she sat down, her hands found their way back to this melody. The tune was nothing fancy. No dramatic crescendos, no complicated runs up and down the keyboard. Just a straightforward progression in C major that her grandmother could have taught her when she was 7 years old. But something about it felt right. It felt like home in a way she couldn't quite put into words. Her roommate was sprawled on the couch upstairs, textbooks spread around her like a paper fortress. The sound of the piano drifted up through the floorboards, but it had become such a constant background noise that she barely noticed anymore. Just another night of endless practice, another melody floating through their small shared space. The young musician hummed along softly as she played, trying out different words that might fit the melody. Most of them felt forced, like trying to squeeze into shoes that were half a size too small. She'd written lyrics before, plenty of them, but they always came out sounding like she was trying too hard to be poetic or deep. This song didn't want that. It wanted something honest. She thought about her mom's kitchen back home, the way sunlight would stream through the window over the sink on Sunday mornings. She thought about her dad's terrible jokes at the dinner table and her little brother's laugh that could fill an entire room. She thought about her dog, an old golden retriever who would rest his head on her lap whenever she felt sad. All of these small, ordinary moments that suddenly felt precious now that she was hundreds of miles away. The words started to come easier then. Nothing revolutionary or groundbreaking. Just simple observations about missing the sound of familiar voices, about how strange it felt to wake up in a room that didn't have her childhood posters on the walls, about longing for the comfort of routines she used to find boring. By 1 a.m, she had something that resembled a complete song. It was rough around the edges, and she stumbled over a few of the lyrics, but it was done. She grabbed her phone from the top of the piano and propped it up against a stack of music books. The recording quality would be terrible, she knew that. The microphone would pick up every creak of the piano bench and probably the sound of her neighbor's television through the thin walls. But she hit record anyway. Her voice wavered a bit on the first line. She almost stopped and started over, but something told her to keep going. This wasn't meant to be perfect. It was meant to be real. She sang about home and distance, about growing up and missing the simplicity of being young. She sang about the weird ache in her chest that showed up at random moments, like when she heard a song her mom used to play or caught a whiff of the same laundry detergent her family used. 3 minutes and 42 seconds later, it was done. She played back the recording, wincing at the parts where her voice cracked and the spot where she hit a wrong note on the piano. A professional musician would have deleted it immediately and tried again. But she felt oddly protective of this imperfect little recording. It was honest in a way that a polished version might not be. She opened up a music sharing app she sometimes used, one of those platforms where independent artists posted their work for a small community of listeners. She'd put up a few instrumental pieces before, and they'd gotten maybe 20 or 30 plays each, mostly from other musicians at her college. Her finger hovered over the upload button. There was still time to delete it, to work on it more, to maybe add some production value or at least fix that wrong note. But it was late and she was tired, and something in her gut said to just let it be what it was. She typed out a simple description. Missing home tonight. Wrote this sitting at my grandmother's old piano. Hope someone out there relates. Then she hit share and closed her laptop. The apartment was quiet now except for the hum of the refrigerator upstairs and the distant sound of cars passing on the street outside. She stood up from the piano bench, her back aching from hours of sitting in the same position. She thought about making herself some tea but decided she was too exhausted. Instead, she climbed the narrow stairs to the main floor, brushed her teeth, and collapsed into bed. Sleep came quickly that night. She dreamed about her childhood home, about summer afternoons in the backyard and winter evenings by the fireplace. Simple dreams, comfortable dreams. She had no way of knowing that across town a young man working the night shift at a warehouse had just put in his earbuds and was scrolling through new music on that same app. He was tired, homesick, and desperately missing his family in another state. When her song started playing, he stopped walking mid-step. He stood there in the middle of the warehouse aisle, surrounded by boxes and fluorescent lights, and felt tears spring to his eyes. He shared it immediately. By the time she woke up the next morning, that warehouse worker's share had been seen by his sister, who shared it with her book club group chat. One of those women shared it with her daughter, who was also away at college and feeling the exact same homesickness. That daughter shared it with her dorm floor group chat. Someone from that chat shared it to their social media. The song was spreading like ripples in a pond, each person finding in it an echo of their own loneliness, their own nostalgia, their own quiet longing for the familiar. But the young musician didn't know any of this yet. She was still asleep, her phone charging on her nightstand, completely unaware that her simple 4-chord song had started a journey that would take it far beyond the basement of her small apartment. She didn't know that by afternoon, everything in her life would start to shift in ways she never could have imagined. All she knew, in that last moment of peaceful sleep before her alarm went off, was that she'd finally finished the song that had been living in her head. And that felt like enough. The morning light was just starting to filter through her bedroom curtains when her phone began to buzz. Once. Twice. Then continuously. A steady stream of notifications that would pull her from sleep and into a day that would change everything. The buzzing wouldn't stop. In her half-asleep state, she thought maybe she'd forgotten to silence her phone before bed. Her hand fumbled across the nightstand, knocking over a water bottle before finally grasping the phone. She squinted at the screen, the brightness making her eyes water in the dim morning light. 47 notifications. She blinked hard and looked again. The number kept climbing as she watched. 52, 58, 63. Her heart started to pound in a way that felt both exciting and terrifying at the same time. She sat up in bed, fully awake now, and opened the music app. The numbers didn't make sense at first. Her song, the one she'd posted just before going to sleep, had been played over 800 times. 800. Her previous uploads had maybe 30 plays total, and most of those were probably her just checking to make sure they'd uploaded correctly. The comment section was filling up faster than she could read. Someone from Oregon wrote that they'd listened 3 times in a row and cried each time. A middle-aged woman in Florida said it reminded her of when her kids first left for college. A young guy working overseas said he'd called his mom after hearing it for the first time in 2 months. Her hands were shaking as she scrolled through message after message of strangers telling her that her simple song had reached into their chests and touched something they didn't even know needed touching. Her roommate knocked on the door, then peeked her head in without waiting for an answer. "Are you okay? I heard you moving around. It's barely 7 in the morning. I think something weird is happening," she said, turning the phone screen toward her roommate. They sat together on the bed for the next 20 minutes, watching the play count tick upward like a slot machine that couldn't stop landing on jackpot. By the time they'd made coffee, the song had passed 2,000 plays. By the time they'd finished breakfast, it was close to 5,000. "This is insane," her roommate kept saying. "This is actually insane." Around noon, a new notification popped up, different from the others. It was a direct message from someone named Mitchell, who ran a small coffee shop downtown called The Daily Grind. She'd been to that place once or twice. They had decent lattes and usually kept the music at a reasonable volume, which was rare for coffee shops these days. The message was short and direct. Mitchell had heard her song through a friend of a friend. He ran an open mic night every Friday evening, and he wondered if she'd be willing to perform. "This Friday?" As in 3 days from now. She read the message 5 times, her coffee getting cold in her hands. "You have to do it," her roommate said, reading over her shoulder. "I've never performed in front of real people before. I mean real people who aren't obligated to clap because they're related to me or feel bad for me. You just connected with thousands of real people through a phone recording. Imagine what you could do in person." Her stomach twisted into knots, but her fingers were already typing out a response before her brain could fully process what she was agreeing to. Yes, she'd love to perform. What time should she arrive? The next 3 days passed in a blur of nervous energy and obsessive practice. She played the song so many times that her roommate begged her to take a break. She practiced in front of her bedroom mirror, trying to figure out where to look and what to do with her face. She recorded herself a dozen times, analyzing every small mistake and vocal wobble. On Thursday night, she barely slept. She kept imagining worst-case scenarios. What if her voice cracked? What if she forgot the words to her own song? What if everyone just stared at her in awkward silence? What if the recording had been a fluke, and the song only worked through a phone speaker with bad audio quality? Friday arrived whether she was ready or not. She chose her outfit carefully, changing 4 times before settling on jeans and a simple sweater. Nothing too fancy. Nothing that looked like she was trying too hard. Her hands wouldn't stop trembling as she packed her bag. The coffee shop was busier than she'd expected when she arrived at 6:30. Mitchell, a friendly guy in his 40s with graying hair and kind eyes, greeted her at the door. He showed her where performers could warm up in a back storage room that smelled like coffee beans and cardboard. "We usually get about 30 to 40 people on open mic nights," he said, "but word got around that you'd be here. We might have a few more tonight." A few more turned out to be an understatement. By 7 o'clock, every table was full. People were standing along the walls. Someone had opened the front door to let in air because the room was getting warm from all the bodies packed inside. She watched from behind the small stage area as other performers went up. A guy with a guitar sang a cover of an old rock song. 2 college students did a comedy sketch that got a few polite laughs. A woman with a beautiful voice performed a jazz standard that deserved more attention than the chatty crowd gave her. Then Mitchell was calling her name, and her legs felt like they might give out as she walked to the microphone. The piano at the Daily Grind was nicer than the one in her basement, a digital keyboard that someone had donated to the shop. She sat down on the bench and adjusted the microphone, her fingers finding the keys more by muscle memory than conscious thought. The room didn't go quiet immediately. People were still talking, still stirring their drinks, still living their lives without any idea what was about to happen. She started playing anyway. The first chord rang out, clear and simple. Then the second. By the third chord, conversations were starting to fade. By the fourth, the room had fallen into the kind of silence that feels almost sacred. She began to sing, and her voice was stronger than she'd expected. All that nervous energy transformed into something else, something that felt like pure honesty pouring out of her. She sang about home and distance, about growing up and growing apart, about the bittersweet ache of becoming someone new while missing who you used to be. She forgot about the crowd. She forgot about her nerves. For 3 minutes and 42 seconds, it was just her and the song and the truth of what the words meant. When the last note faded, there was a beat of absolute silence, that terrible moment where performers wonder if they've completely bombed. Then the applause started, and it was like nothing she'd ever experienced. It wasn't polite clapping. It was thunderous. People were standing up. Someone let out a whistle. She saw tears on faces throughout the crowd, people wiping their eyes and smiling at the same time. She stood up from the piano bench, overwhelmed and shaking, and tried to take it all in. That's when she noticed him. An older gentleman sitting at a corner table, probably in his 50s, with silver hair and an expensive-looking jacket. He wasn't clapping like everyone else. He was just watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. As the applause finally died down and she made her way off the small stage, the man stood up and walked toward her. He pulled a business card from his jacket pocket and held it out. "That was remarkable," he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the noise of the crowd returning to their conversations. "I wonder if you have a few minutes to talk. I have a proposition that might interest you." She took the card with trembling fingers. The name on it meant nothing to her, but the title underneath made her heart skip a beat. Music producer and talent developer. Her simple song had just opened a door she hadn't even known existed. The coffee shop was still buzzing with energy, even after most of the open mic performers had packed up and left. People kept coming up to her, shaking her hand, asking if she had any recordings they could buy or download. She felt overwhelmed in the best possible way, like she'd just run a marathon, and her body didn't know whether to collapse or keep running on pure adrenaline. The producer waited patiently at his corner table, sipping what must have been his 3rd cup of coffee that evening. When she finally made her way over to him, her legs still shaky from the performance, he gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Please, sit," he said. "You look like you might fall over." She sat down gratefully, clutching her water bottle like it was the only solid thing in a spinning world. Up close, the producer had kind eyes with crow's feet that suggested he smiled often. His silver hair was neat but not overly styled, and there was something about his presence that felt both professional and genuinely warm. "That was something special," he said, leaning back in his chair. "I've been working in music for over 30 years, and I can count on one hand the number of times I've seen a room go that silent for a performer. You have a gift for honesty, and that's rarer than technical skill." "Thank you," she managed, her voice still rough from singing. "I honestly didn't know what would happen up there. Can I ask you something?" He folded his hands on the table. "What are your plans for this song? For your music in general?" She blinked at him, caught off guard by the directness of the question. "I don't know. I mean, I've been writing songs since I was a kid, but I never really thought about it as something I could do seriously. I'm studying education at the university. I was going to teach music to middle schoolers." He nodded slowly, seeming to consider this. "Teaching is noble work. But what if I told you there might be another path, at least worth exploring?" Her heart started beating faster. "What do you mean?" "I don't want to produce your music," he said, which surprised her. "I don't want to take your song and polish it into something commercial and slick. What made your performance powerful tonight was its rawness, its authenticity. If we tried to make it into something it's not, we'd lose that." "Then what are you suggesting?" He pulled out his phone and scrolled through something, then turned it toward her. "I work with musicians who want to stay true to their vision. I help them find collaborators, connect them with venues, guide them through the business side of things without compromising their art. And I know 3 people who I think could help your song become even more than what it already is." She looked at the phone screen. There were photos of musicians she didn't recognize. One was an older woman with a cello. Another was a young guy surrounded by various drums and percussion instruments. The third was a singer with a bright smile and confident eyes. "I don't understand," she said. "My song is just piano and vocals. That's all it needs." "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe there are layers to your song that you can't see yet because you're too close to it." These 3 musicians, they're not about showing off or adding unnecessary complexity. They're about listening deeply and finding what's already there, hiding in the spaces between the notes. She felt a flutter of something in her chest. Fear, maybe, or excitement. Possibly both. "I would never push you to do something you're uncomfortable with," he continued. "But I'd like to propose an experiment. Come to my studio. Play your song for these 3 musicians. Let them listen and see if anything emerges naturally. If it doesn't feel right, we stop immediately and you walk away with no hard feelings. Just one rehearsal? Just one. No commitment beyond that. But I have a feeling about this, and I've learned to trust my instincts over the years." She thought about her grandmother's piano sitting in the basement. She thought about how many times she'd played that song alone, never imagining anyone else would hear it. She thought about the faces in the coffee shop tonight, the tears and the smiles, and the way strangers had connected with something she'd created in a moment of homesickness. "What if adding other instruments ruins it?" she asked quietly. "Then we'll know," he said simply. "But what if it doesn't? What if it helps the song become what it was always meant to be?" She looked around the coffee shop. Mitchell was wiping down tables, and a few lingering customers were having quiet conversations over their nearly empty mugs. Just a few hours ago, this had been a room full of people who'd been moved by her simple song. "One rehearsal," she said finally. "No promises beyond that." The producer smiled, and it was genuine and warm. "That's all I'm asking. How about Tuesday afternoon? Say 2 o'clock?" He wrote down the address on a napkin, and she folded it carefully and put it in her pocket. They talked for another 20 minutes about logistics and expectations. He told her stories about other musicians he'd worked with, about the difference between commercial success and artistic fulfillment, about how the music industry had changed over his 3 decades in it. "The best advice I can give you," he said as they prepared to leave, "is to stay connected to why you wrote the song in the first place. Not for fame or money or recognition. You wrote it because you felt something true and needed to express it. As long as you hold on to that, you'll be okay." She walked back to her car in a daze, the cool night air helping to clear her head. Her phone buzzed with more messages and notifications, but she didn't check them yet. She just sat in the driver's seat for a moment, her hands on the steering wheel, trying to process everything that had happened. 6 months ago, she'd been just another college student struggling with homesickness and the overwhelming challenge of figuring out who she was becoming. She'd written a simple song as a way to express feelings she couldn't quite put into words. And now a professional producer wanted to help her take that song further. When she got home, her roommate was waiting up, eager to hear every detail. They stayed up until nearly 2 in the morning, replaying the evening, analyzing every comment and conversation. Her roommate was convinced this was the beginning of something big. "What if it's not, though?" she asked. "What if Tuesday's rehearsal is terrible, and everyone realizes the song only works when it's just me? Then you'll still have played at an open mic and had a room full of strangers applaud for you," her roommate said. "That's more than most people ever get, but I don't think that's what's going to happen." "What do you think will happen?" Her roommate smiled. "I think your song is about to teach you something about collaboration and trust. I think you're about to learn that letting other people help you isn't the same as giving up control." That night, she dreamed about music. Not her song specifically, but the idea of music itself. She dreamed about how individual notes mean something on their own, but create something entirely different when they come together in harmony. She dreamed about her grandmother teaching her piano when she was 7, showing her how the right hand and left hand work together to create something neither could do alone. When she woke up Tuesday morning, she felt nervous, but also curious. The address on the napkin sat on her nightstand, and she picked it up and read it again. A converted warehouse in the industrial district. It sounded mysterious and slightly intimidating. She spent the morning practicing, running through her song over and over on her grandmother's piano. But this time, as she played, she tried to imagine what it might sound like with other voices added. A cello perhaps adding depth and warmth, subtle percussion giving it a heartbeat, harmonies that lifted and supported without overshadowing. By the time she needed to leave for the rehearsal, she'd made peace with her nervousness. This was an experiment, nothing more. She could walk away at any time if it didn't feel right, but she also owed it to herself and to her song to at least see what was possible. She grabbed her keys and her bag, took one last look at the basement piano, and headed out the door. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, that uncertainty felt like an adventure rather than something to fear. The address led her across town, toward a part of the city she didn't know well. As she drove, she thought about what the producer had said, about staying connected to why she wrote the song, about artistic integrity versus commercial success, about finding collaborators who understood the difference between enhancement and interference. She didn't know what would happen in that warehouse studio, but she knew her simple song had already taken her further than she'd ever imagined, and maybe, just maybe, it had a few more surprises left to share. The warehouse came into view, its brick exterior weathered but solid, its windows reflecting the afternoon sun. She pulled into the parking lot, turned off the engine, and sat for a moment, gathering her courage. Then she grabbed her bag, took a deep breath, and walked toward the door. Whatever happened next, she was ready to find out. The first rehearsal was scheduled for a Tuesday afternoon at 2 o'clock. She'd written the address down 3 times, checked it twice more on her phone, and still managed to drive past the building before realizing it was the right place. The studio didn't look like much from the outside. It was a converted warehouse in an industrial part of town, the kind of neighborhood where artists rented space because the landlords didn't ask too many questions and the rent was cheap. The building's brick exterior was weathered and covered in faded murals, and the front door looked like it might fall off its hinges if you pulled too hard. But when she stepped inside, everything changed. The main room had soaring ceilings with skylights that let in streams of natural light. The walls were covered in acoustic panels, and the hardwood floor gleamed like it had been recently refinished. In the center of the space sat a beautiful grand piano, its black surface so polished she could see her reflection in it. The producer was already there, setting up microphones and adjusting equipment. He waved her over with a warm smile that helped settle some of her nerves. "The others should be here any minute," he said. "I thought we'd start simple today. You play your song the way you've been playing it, and they'll just listen. Then we'll see what happens naturally." She sat at the piano, running her fingers over the keys. They felt different from her grandmother's old upright, smoother and more responsive. She played a few scales to warm up, the notes ringing out clear and bright in the open space. The cellist arrived first. She was older, probably in her 70s. With silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and eyes that seemed to carry decades of stories. She wheeled her cello case through the door like it weighed nothing, moving with the practiced ease of someone who'd been doing this for most of her life. "I'm Grace," she said, extending her hand. Her grip was firm and warm. "I heard your recording. Made me cry right there in my kitchen. My husband thought something was wrong." Before she could respond, the door opened again and a younger man walked in, carrying what looked like several bags of percussion equipment. He couldn't have been more than 25, with an easy smile and dreadlocks pulled back with a colorful band. "Traffic was terrible," he said by way of greeting. "I'm Dev. I brought options." He started pulling out various instruments: a snare drum, brushes, a small collection of hand percussion, even a few things she couldn't name. The last to arrive was the harmony vocalist, a woman in her mid-30s with a voice that seemed to fill the room even when she was just saying hello. Her name was Keisha, and she carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd spent years performing. "Sorry I'm late," Keisha said, though she was actually right on time. "I had to convince my babysitter to stay an extra hour." The producer gathered them all in a loose circle and explained his vision. This wasn't about changing the song or making it into something it wasn't. It was about finding what was already there, hidden in the spaces between the notes. Each musician would listen first, really listen, and only add something if it felt necessary. She took her place at the piano, suddenly aware of 4 pairs of eyes on her. Her hands felt clumsy as she positioned them over the keys, and for a terrifying moment, she couldn't remember how the song started. Then she closed her eyes, took a breath, and let her fingers find their way home. The song poured out of her the same way it always did, simple, honest, unadorned. When she finished, she opened her eyes to find Grace wiping tears from her cheeks. "Can I try something?" Grace asked softly. She nodded, not trusting her voice. Grace positioned her cello and drew the bow across the strings, creating a low, resonant note that seemed to vibrate in the chest. Then she began to play a counter melody, something that wove around the main tune like a gentle embrace. It was different from the original song, but it fit so perfectly that it felt like it had been missing all along. The young musician felt her throat tighten with emotion. She started the song again, and this time Grace joined her from the beginning. The cello added depth and richness, turning the simple melody into something that felt almost 3-dimensional. When they finished, Dev was already reaching for his brushes. "What if we kept it really subtle?" he said. "Just a heartbeat kind of rhythm. Nothing that takes attention away from the vocals and that beautiful piano line." They tried it again. This time Dev added the softest percussion, his brushes whispering against the snare drum in a pattern that did indeed sound like a heartbeat. It created a sense of forward motion without overwhelming anything else. Keisha had been sitting quietly, just listening and moving her head slightly with the music. Now she stood up and moved closer to the piano. "I'm hearing a harmony on the second verse," she said. "Something that sits just above your melody, may I?" The 4th time through the song was when everything clicked into place. The piano provided the foundation, steady and true. Grace's cello wove its melancholy counter-melody through the spaces. Dev's gentle percussion gave it a pulse, a reminder that this was a song about being alive and human, and Keisha's harmony lifted the whole thing skyward, adding a layer of hope to the homesickness. When the last note faded, nobody spoke for a long moment. The silence felt important, like breaking it too soon would shatter something fragile and precious. Finally, the producer cleared his throat. "That's it," he said simply. "That's the song." They rehearsed it 5 more times that afternoon, making tiny adjustments. Grace suggested they bring the cello in a measure earlier in the second verse. Dev experimented with adding a subtle accent on the snare at key moments. Keisha worked out exactly where her harmony should enter and exit, making sure it enhanced rather than competed. What amazed her most was how generous everyone was. Nobody tried to show off or add unnecessary flourishes. They all seemed to understand that the song's power came from its simplicity, and their job was to serve the song, not their own egos. By 5 o'clock, they'd recorded 3 complete takes. The producer played them back through the studio speakers, and she sat on the floor hugging her knees, listening to her simple song transformed into something she'd never imagined possible. It was still her song. She could hear her grandmother's piano in the foundation of it, could feel her own homesickness in the melody, but now it had layers of experience and emotion that she hadn't been able to express alone. Grace's cello carried the weight of years and wisdom. Dev's percussion added youth and vitality. Keisha's harmony suggested that even in loneliness, we're never truly alone. "This is just the beginning," the producer said as they packed up their instruments. "I submitted this to the New Artist Showcase 3 weeks ago, right after I heard your coffee shop performance. The results come out tomorrow." Her heart stopped. "The New Artist Showcase? That's one of the biggest competitions in the state." "I know," he said with a knowing smile. "I've been doing this for 30 years. I know when something special walks through my door." That night she couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about the 4 of them in that warehouse studio, about how strangers had come together and created something beautiful, about how her simple song had grown into something bigger than herself, without losing what made it true in the first place. The next morning, her phone rang at 8 o'clock. It was the producer, and she could hear the smile in his voice before he even spoke. "Pack your best outfit," he said. "We're performing at the Riverside Concert Hall in 6 weeks. We won." She sat down hard on her bed, the phone pressed to her ear, unable to form words. 2,000 seats, he continued. Sold-out show. Talent scouts from 3 major labels confirmed they'll be there. Her simple song was about to take her somewhere she'd never dared to dream of going, and she wouldn't be going alone. The 6 weeks passed in a blur of rehearsals, phone calls, and moments where she had to remind herself that this was actually happening. The Riverside Concert Hall wasn't just any venue. It was the kind of place where symphonies performed, where famous musicians came through on national tours. And somehow, impossibly, her simple song had earned her a spot on that stage. The night before the performance, she couldn't eat dinner. Her roommate tried to get her to have at least some soup, but her stomach was tied in knots so tight she thought she might be sick. She'd performed the song dozens of times in rehearsal, had it memorized so deeply she could probably play it in her sleep. But this was different. This was 2,000 people. This was talent scouts who could change her entire life with a single phone call. "What if I mess up?" she asked her roommate for the 100th time. "Then you mess up," her roommate said simply. "You're human." They're human. Everyone will survive. But it didn't feel that simple. She arrived at the concert hall at 4 in the afternoon, 3 hours before the show started. The producer had told her to come early, to get comfortable with the space and do a sound check. When she walked through the stage entrance, her breath caught in her throat. The hall was massive. Row after row of red velvet seats stretched back into shadows, rising up in tiers that seemed to reach the ornate ceiling. The stage itself was bigger than her entire apartment. The grand piano sat in a pool of light, waiting. Grace was already there, her cello case open beside her. She was doing stretches, moving her fingers through exercises that looked almost like a dance. When she saw the young musician, she smiled warmly. "Big space, isn't it?" Grace said. "I've played here 4 times over the years. It never stops being intimidating. How do you deal with the nerves?" Grace thought for a moment, her fingers still moving through their warm-up patterns. "I remember why I'm here. Not for the scouts or the audience or the prestige. I'm here because there's a song that needs to be played, and I get to be part of telling that story. Everything else is just noise." Dev arrived next, pushing a cart loaded with his carefully selected percussion instruments. He was wearing a suit jacket over a vintage band t-shirt, somehow making the combination look intentional and cool. He set up his equipment with practiced efficiency, testing each piece to make sure it sounded right in the larger space. Keisha showed up with her husband and 2 kids in tow. Her daughter, who couldn't have been more than 5, ran straight to the piano and pressed one key with delight at the sound that echoed through the empty hall. She wanted to see where Mommy was singing, Keisha explained. "I hope that's okay." "It's perfect," the producer said, emerging from the wings. He'd been checking technical details with the sound crew. "Let's do a quick run-through while the hall is still empty. Get comfortable with how it sounds in here." They took their positions. She sat at the piano, and for a moment the size of the space overwhelmed her. Her hands felt small on the keys. Her voice felt tiny in the vastness. Then she remembered what Grace had said. She was here for the song. Nothing else mattered. She started playing, and the acoustics of the hall transformed the simple chords into something rich and full. Grace's cello joined in, and the sound seemed to wrap around the empty seats like a warm blanket. Dev's gentle percussion provided the heartbeat, and Keisha's harmony lifted everything up toward the ornate ceiling. When they finished, Keisha's daughter applauded with the pure, unfiltered enthusiasm that only children possess. "Mommy, that was so pretty." Something about that innocent praise settled her nerves more than any professional compliment could have. The next 2 hours passed in a strange combination of slow and fast. She ate a granola bar in the dressing room because her roommate had insisted she have something in her stomach. She paced. She checked her phone. She played scales on an old upright piano someone had pushed into the corner of the backstage area. At 7 o'clock, she heard the murmur of the arriving crowd through the walls. The sound started as a trickle and grew into a wave of voices, laughter, the shuffling of programs and coats. 2,000 people finding their seats, completely unaware of how terrified she was on the other side of the curtain. The producer came to find her at 7:20. "You're on in 10 minutes. There are 3 other acts before the headliner, but you're opening. Are you ready?" She wanted to say no. She wanted to run out the back door and keep running until she was back in her basement apartment with her grandmother's old piano and no one watching. But Grace appeared beside her and squeezed her shoulder gently. "The song knows what to do," Grace said. "You just have to let it out." At 7:30 exactly, the house lights dimmed. She stood in the wings, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat, in her fingertips, in her temples. She watched as a stagehand walked out and adjusted the microphone. "Stand one last time." Then the stage manager was counting down with his fingers. 3, 2, 1. The spotlight came up on the empty piano bench, and somewhere in the darkness beyond the light, 1,000 conversations faded to silence. She walked out onto the stage, her legs feeling both numb and shaky at the same time. The spotlight was bright enough that she couldn't see past the first few rows, which was somehow both terrifying and comforting. Grace, Dev, and Keisha took their positions around her, their familiar presence like anchors keeping her from floating away. She sat down at the piano bench. The keys were cool under her fingers. She could hear someone cough in the audience, the rustle of a program, the creak of a seat. 2,000 people waiting to hear what she had to say. She thought about her grandmother's old piano in the basement. She thought about that night she'd recorded the song on her phone, never imagining anyone beyond a few friends might hear it. She thought about the coffee shop and the strangers who'd cried and the message from Mitchell that had started all of this. She thought about home and distance and the ache of growing up, and then she started to play. The first chord filled the hall and suddenly everything else fell away. The nerves, the scouts, the 2,000 faces in the darkness. All that existed was the song and the truth it carried. Grace's cello wove in with its melancholy wisdom. Dev's brushes whispered their heartbeat rhythm. Keisha's voice lifted in harmony, and together they told the story of a simple song that had found its way home. She sang about missing familiar voices and wanting to go back to moments that had already passed. She sang about the strange courage it takes to move forward even when your heart is pulling you backward. She sang about learning that you can carry home inside you, even when you're far away. The song built and swelled, each musician adding their piece to the whole, until the final note hung in the air like a question waiting for an answer, then silence. That terrible, beautiful moment where time seems to stop. The applause started somewhere in the middle of the hall and spread like wildfire. People weren't just clapping. They were standing. The sound was deafening, a wave of appreciation and recognition that crashed over the stage. She looked at Grace, who had tears streaming down her face. She looked at Dev, grinning so wide she thought his face might split. She looked at Keisha, who mouthed, "We did it," across the stage. But more than anything, she felt the truth that Grace had told her earlier settling into her bones. She hadn't been there for the applause or the scouts or the recognition. She'd been there because a simple song needed to be shared, and she'd been brave enough to let it grow into something bigger than herself. After the show, 3 different talent scouts approached her with business cards and promises. The local news wanted an interview. Someone from a music blog asked for a quote. But what she remembered most was the older woman who waited by the stage door with tears in her eyes. "I haven't called my daughter in 6 months," the woman said. "We had a fight. Stupid stuff. But your song reminded me that life's too short. I'm calling her tomorrow." That's when she understood what her simple song had really become. Not a masterpiece in the traditional sense. Not something that would win awards or top charts. But something that reminded people of their own hearts, their own homes, their own capacity to love and be loved. She'd started with 4 chords in a basement apartment. She'd ended with a community, a message, and the knowledge that sometimes the simplest truths are the ones that need to be heard the most. The song had taken over the stage, but more importantly, it had found its way into the places where it mattered most, into hearts that needed reminding that they weren't alone.